It's roughly 9,000 years ago, somewhere in the limestone highlands of what is now southeastern Turkey. A community of people, not nomadic hunter-gatherers, but not quite farmers yet either, something in between, have gathered at a site that required significant labor to build. The stone pillars around them weigh up to 20 tons each. Someone organized the quarrying. Someone organized the transport. Dozens, maybe hundreds of people coordinated over an extended period to put this place together, which means this site mattered enough to justify that kind of investment before a single stone was moved. And now there's a burial happening. An important person, we don't know their name, their specific role, their relationship to everyone gathered, is being interred with ceremony. And around the edges of the ritual space, there are large stone vessels. Some of them hold up to 160 liters of liquid. Residue analysis published by researchers from Istanbul University in 2021 found evidence of oxalic acid in those vessels, a chemical signature consistent with fermented grain, with wheat or barley processed into something that wasn't bread. The people gathered at Göbekli Tepe for what may have been a funeral, or a seasonal ritual, or both simultaneously, were drinking. Probably a lot. And the question that the stone vessels and the oxalic acid traces force into the open is not whether this happened. It's why drinking and death and large collective ritual ended up in the same place, at the same time, in a pattern that shows up so consistently across so many cultures that it starts to look less like a coincidence and more like a solution to a problem. Here's the argument this video is making, stated plainly before we build it. The association between alcohol, or more broadly, fermented and psychoactive substances, and human ritual, and particularly funerary ritual, is not incidental. It's not just about numbing grief or because people in the ancient world liked to party at any opportunity. The connection runs deeper than that, into the specific psychological and social functions that altered states serve in moments of collective crisis, and into the specific demands that death places on a community's social cohesion. When you trace the archaeological evidence, from Göbekli Tepe in Turkey to a Natufian burial site in Israel to Bronze Age feasting halls in Britain, a consistent pattern emerges. Drinking at funerals and rituals wasn't self-medication. It was technology, a social technology, deployed deliberately to manage the exact moments when human communities are most structurally vulnerable. And understanding why our ancestors built that connection tells you something real about why you still feel the pull of it at a wake, at a wedding, at any gathering where something significant is being marked and the emotional stakes are high. Start with the chemistry, because it grounds everything that follows in something concrete. Ethanol, the specific alcohol in fermented beverages, acts on the brain through multiple pathways, but the one most relevant to ritual context is its effect on the GABA system. GABA is the primary inhibitory neurotransmitter in the human brain. It reduces neural excitability. Alcohol enhances GABA activity and simultaneously suppresses glutamate, the primary excitatory neurotransmitter, which produces the characteristic relaxation and reduced social inhibition that low to moderate alcohol consumption generates. In a neurological sense, drinking makes the social filters thinner. The calculations about hierarchy, about who is watching you and how you'll be judged, about the risks of saying the wrong thing, these all become slightly less dominant, slightly less insistent. The self-monitoring that governs behavior in normal social contexts loosens. In most everyday situations, that loosening is somewhere between mildly pleasant and actively problematic, depending on the context and the quantity. But in a ritual context, specifically in a funerary context, where a community is gathered around a death and the emotional and social pressure of that gathering is at maximum, the same neurochemical effect becomes something different in function. Death is the moment when the social fabric is most acutely stressed. The person who died held relationships with every person present. Those relationships now need to be renegotiated. The grief is real, the loss is specific, and the community's capacity to absorb that grief collectively, to hold it together rather than fracture under it, depends on people being able to access emotional states and social connections that normal inhibition might block. Anthropologist David Dietler, who has spent decades studying the role of alcohol in ancient and traditional societies, and whose 2006 paper, Alcohol, Anthropological and Archaeological Perspectives, remains a key reference in the field, makes the case that fermented beverages in pre-modern contexts served primarily as social lubricants in the specific technical sense. They lowered the transaction costs of collective emotional experience. Grief shared is grief distributed. Laughter at a wake, which seems jarring from a certain cultural standpoint, is actually one of the most effective group-level grief management tools that exists. Getting a room full of people to the place where they can laugh together about the person who just died, is substantially easier when the neurochemical barriers to that kind of emotional openness have been chemically reduced. That's the proximate mechanism. The deeper question is how the association got formalized. How did drinking become not just something that happened at gatherings, but something that was structurally embedded in the ritual itself, something that was prepared in advance, stored in specific vessels, offered in specific quantities, at specific moments in the ceremony? The Natufian burial site at Rakefet Cave in Israel, excavated by a team from the University of Haifa led by Danny Nadel and published in 2013, pushed the earliest evidence for intentional fermentation back to roughly 13,000 years ago. The Natufians were hunter-gatherers with semi-sedentary settlement patterns, and they were burying their dead in the same caves where they lived, an intimacy with the deceased that is itself revealing about how death was being integrated into community life rather than separated from it. The stone mortars found at the burial site showed residue of starch granules and phytoliths consistent with the processing of wheat, barley, and possibly other plant materials in a way that, when Nadel's team modeled the processing steps involved, was more consistent with fermentation than with simple food preparation. The dead were being buried near the place where fermented beverages were being made, and possibly made specifically for funerary occasions. What the Rakefet evidence suggests, and the researchers are careful to frame it as a suggestion rather than a certainty, is that the deliberate production of fermented beverages may predate settled agriculture by thousands of years. And crucially, the context of that production appears to be ritual and funerary rather than purely nutritional. Some scholars have gone further than Nadel's team and argued that the demand for fermented grain at ritual gatherings was itself one of the pressures that drove early humans toward the deliberate cultivation of cereal crops. That beer, or something functionally equivalent to it, came before bread in the human story. Patrick McGovern at the University of Pennsylvania, who has spent his career doing chemical analysis of residues in ancient vessels, has made versions of this argument across several books and papers. It remains contested, but the contestation is interesting in itself. The idea that ritual social needs, rather than simple caloric necessity, drove one of the most consequential technological transitions in human history is the kind of claim that deserves serious engagement. Back to Göbekli Tepe, because it's the most dramatic single piece of evidence for this whole picture. The site, excavated since 1994 primarily by Klaus Schmidt of the German Archaeological Institute, until his death in 2014, and continued by subsequent teams, has fundamentally reshaped the archaeological understanding of what was cognitively and socially possible for pre-agricultural humans. The scale of construction, 20-ton limestone pillars, some carved with animal reliefs, arranged in enclosures that required organizational capacity far beyond what a small local band could provide, implies a level of social coordination that was previously thought to require agriculture and settlement as its foundation. Göbekli Tepe reverses the causal arrow. The ritual site existed first. The organizational complexity required to build it may have driven, rather than resulted from, the move toward agriculture and surplus food production in the surrounding region. And those 160-liter stone vessels. The fermentation evidence. The scale of liquid storage at a site that appears to have hosted large gatherings of people who didn't live there permanently. What you're looking at is the infrastructure for communal drinking at collective rituals, built into the physical design of one of the oldest monumental structures ever found. The drinking wasn't incidental to the ritual. It was planned for. The vessels were part of the architecture. The Bronze Age feasting halls of Britain add another layer to this pattern, from a much later time period and a very different cultural context. At sites like Tintagel in Cornwall and various hill fort complexes across Wales and Scotland, archaeologists have found the physical signatures of large-scale communal feasting, animal bone deposits in quantities that imply deliberate slaughter for gatherings rather than routine subsistence, ceramic vessel fragments consistent with serving and drinking, and in some cases evidence of imported goods, wine amphorae from the Mediterranean, that reached Britain through trade networks specifically to supply these events. Many of these feasting deposits are associated with burial mounds or mortuary enclosures. The feast and the funeral are physically co-located in the archaeological record repeatedly across centuries. Here's where intellectual honesty requires pumping the brakes on the cleaner version of this argument. The claim that alcohol served a specific, functional, quasi-rational role in ancient funerary ritual, that it was deployed as social technology risks projecting backward a level of intentionality that the evidence doesn't fully support. People in ancient communities almost certainly didn't gather and say, "We need to reduce social inhibition to facilitate collective grief processing. Let's prepare fermented grain beverages." The association between drinking and ritual developed over time through a process that was probably much more organic and iterative than any functional account suggests. Fermented beverages were discovered accidentally, overripe fruit, stored grain that got wet, and their effects were experienced before they were theorized. The ritualization happened gradually, as communities found that certain practices worked at certain moments and incorporated them into the script for those moments without necessarily analyzing why they worked. There's also the problem of the survivorship of evidence. The sites and vessels that preserve chemical residues of fermented beverages are a tiny and non-random sample of the total ritual activity that occurred in the prehistoric period. We find evidence at places like Göbekli Tepe because stone survives. We find residues in ceramic and stone vessels because those materials preserve chemical signatures. But rituals conducted in organic materials, in open spaces, without the specific preservation conditions required for chemical analysis, those leave nothing recoverable. The pattern we see in the evidence may look more consistent than the actual prehistoric reality was. And the functional account, while compelling, doesn't explain everything. Some cultures developed robust ritual traditions without alcohol as a central element. Some used other psychoactive substances. Some relied on fasting, sleep deprivation, rhythmic movement, or extreme physical environments to achieve the altered states that ritual seems to require. Alcohol was one solution to a set of problems. It wasn't the only one, and treating it as universal misses the variation. Come back to those stone vessels at Göbekli Tepe, 160 liters each, carved from the same limestone as the pillars around them. Sitting at the edge of a ritual space built by people who had to coordinate across tribal boundaries to construct it, gathered around a burial or a seasonal ceremony or both, drinking something made from grain in a region that wouldn't reliably cultivate grain for another 1,000 years or more. What was actually happening in that moment? The grief was real, assuming it was a funeral. The social pressure of the gathering was real. The organizational achievement of being there at all, in that space, in those numbers, was real. And the fermented beverage in those vessels was doing work that no other available technology could do as efficiently. Reducing the friction of collective emotional experience, lowering the barriers between individuals who might otherwise remain locked in their separate grief. Creating the neurochemical conditions for the kind of shared vulnerability that transforms a group of individuals present at a death into a community that has survived one. That's what Awake is. That's what it has always been. The specifics change: the grape, the grain, the vessel, the prayer said before the first drink, but the underlying structure is the same across 13,000 years of documented evidence, and probably longer before that. You gather around the fact of death, which is the most isolating fact there is. You do something together that creates a shared state. And in that shared state, the isolation becomes, briefly, collective, which is the closest thing to manageable that death really offers. If the deep historical archaeology of why humans do what they do at the moments that matter most is the thread you keep following, this channel has more of it. Subscribe, leave a comment with what you think the first fermented beverage actually was: the grape, the grain, the honey, or something else entirely, because McGovern's chemical evidence makes a case for each one, and the debate is genuinely unsettled. And check the previous video on ancient entertainment if you want to see where the nighttime fire circle and the fermented vessels sit next to each other in the same picture. The vessels are still full. We're still gathering around them.